The cold never bothered Jedediah Colton anymore. 12 Wyoming winters had seen to that. Dawn painted the ranch in shades of gray as Jed moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Frost coated the fence rails and crusted the water troughs he broke with practiced swings of his axe. The horses recognized his footsteps before he reached the barn, their soft nickering the only conversation he'd had in weeks. Inside, the troubled colt watched him warily from the corner stall, its eyes rolling white at the edges. 3 ranchers had given up on the animal before Sam Blackwood brought it to Jed's place, claiming if anyone could gentle the beast, it would be the man who understood wildness and pain. "Easy now," Jed murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Storm's coming. I feel it too." The colt's ears flicked forward at his words, recognition flickering in its dark eyes. Jed extended his hand, palm flat, and waited. Patience was something he had in abundance. The empty hours of a solitary life had taught him that much. As he worked through his chores, Jed studied the western sky. The barometer was falling faster than he'd seen in years. By nightfall, the ranch would face the worst blizzard in memory, a storm that would test more than just the strength of his fences and the durability of his barns. Turning toward the house, Jed's gaze instinctively avoided the small bedroom door he hadn't opened in 12 years. Sam Blackwood had worked for 3 generations of Coltons, but he'd never seen a man prepare for a storm with the focused intensity Jed brought to everything since the night he lost his family. "North pasture fence is reinforced," Sam reported, stamping snow from his boots. At 65, the half-Cherokee former cavalry scout moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man. "Cattle are gathered in the sheltered draw." Jed nodded, hammering another board across the barn window. "Wells bought the Peterson place yesterday," he said, without looking up. Sam's weathered face tightened. "Offering cash to anyone willing to sell before spring." Peterson should have known better. "Man's got 5 children and a sick wife." Jed drove another nail with unnecessary force. "And now no land." Sam watched him with dark, knowing eyes. Might be he didn't have much choice. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Every rancher in the territory was feeling the pressure. 3 years of falling beef prices after the Panic of '84, followed by the harshest winter in memory. Small operations were folding weekly, gobbled up by Eastern money men like Harrison Wells, who smelled opportunity in other men's desperation. 3 more boards on the east side," Jed said, changing the subject. "Storms coming from that direction." Sam glanced toward the darkening sky. "Never seen the glass drop so fast. Provisions?" "Enough for 3 weeks, if it comes to that." Jed calculated mentally, feed for the livestock, supplies for the house. They'd make it through, but with nothing to spare. Another winter like this, and the Colton Ranch might join the Peterson place under Wells's ownership. As the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, Jed spotted something impossible through the thickening white, a lone rider, clearly lost, struggling toward the ranch from the east. No one traveled in weather like this unless they were running from something worse than death, or didn't know enough to fear what a Wyoming blizzard could do. "Get inside," Jed told Sam, reaching for his heavy coat. "I'll bring them in." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Them?" "Whoever's fool enough to be out in this." The wind sliced through layers of wool and leather as Jed pushed through snowdrifts already knee-high. The rider had dismounted, leading a struggling horse through the blinding whiteness. Twice they disappeared completely in the swirling snow before Jed reached them. "This way!" he shouted above the wind's howl. The figure looked up, face obscured by an ice-crusted scarf. Only when they stumbled and Jed caught them did he realize the rider was a woman. Her gloved hand clutched a leather satchel, and the shape of a camera case was strapped to the saddle. "Just a little further," he urged, taking the horse's reins and guiding both toward the lantern light of the house. By the time they reached the porch, the woman was barely walking, her boots dragging through the snow. Inside, she collapsed into the chair Jed pulled toward the fire, her frozen fingers fumbling with her scarf. "The station master at Rawlins said I could make Garrison before the storm," she managed through chattering teeth. "Station master was wrong. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Carter. Eliza May Carter." Philadelphia Illustrated News. Her eyes, a startling clear blue against her wind-burned face, met his with unexpected directness. Jed stiffened. "You're a long way from Philadelphia." Sam appeared with blankets, wrapping one around her shoulders while Jed poured coffee. The horse would need tending, the woman clearly needed warming, and there was no possibility of travel until the storm passed. The routine Jed had maintained for 12 years was already unraveling. As Eliza warmed by the fire, her gaze drifted to the partially open door across the room, revealing a small bedroom preserved like a museum, untouched for years. The moment Jed noticed her looking, something shifted in his eyes, and he shut the door with a quiet finality that raised more questions than it answered. "Storm's setting in," Sam said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Might be here for days, Miss Carter." Eliza looked from Sam to Jed, clearly reading the tension in the latter's rigid posture. "I apologize for the imposition, Mr. Colton," he supplied. "Jedediah Colton. Mr. Colton, I assure you I'll be on my way as soon as the weather permits." Jed nodded once, then turned toward the kitchen. "I'll see to your horse." The wind howled against the windows, and Eliza pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching the door close behind the man who'd saved her life, but clearly wished she'd never arrived. By midnight, Eliza's fever had climbed high enough that Jed found himself doing something he hadn't done in 7 years, sending for Doc Miller, the woman who hadn't been able to save his wife and son. "She's burning up," Jed told Sam, his voice low as they stood in the kitchen. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like angry fists. "Exposure's setting in?" Sam glanced toward the main room where Eliza lay wrapped in blankets near the fire, her breathing shallow, cheeks flushed with fever. "Storm's at its worst." "Track to town will be near impossible." "Take the south draw," Jed said, already gathering supplies. "Follow the creek bed where the trees break the wind. Doc Miller's place is closer than town." Sam studied him with knowing eyes. "You sure about this?" The question carried weight beyond the journey's danger. Abigail Miller hadn't set foot on the Colton Ranch since that night 12 years ago. The night when all her medical knowledge couldn't save Sarah or the baby. "Woman needs a doctor," Jed answered simply. After Sam left, Jed returned to Eliza's side. Her eyes fluttered open when he placed a cool cloth on her forehead, bright with fever and confusion. "Someone lived here with you," she murmured. "Rest. Doctor's coming." "The room. Was it your wife?" Jed's hand stilled. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling fire and the endless keening of the wind. "And my son." Eliza's feverish gaze held his. "I'm sorry." He turned away, busying himself with the kettle, measuring herbs he'd learned to use when the nearest doctor was half a day's ride. 12 years of self-reliance had taught him more than he'd ever wanted to know about making do alone. Eliza drifted in and out of consciousness as the night deepened. Each time she woke, Jed was there, silently offering water or adjusting the blankets. In her fevered state, she spoke of Philadelphia streets, of cameras and photographs, of a husband lost to Gettysburg's bloody fields. When Doc Miller arrived, her eyes met Jed's. With 12 years of shared grief, neither had ever put into words, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. Not this time. While Doc Miller fought Eliza's fever at the Colton Ranch, Harrison Wells sat in Sheriff Riley's office in Garrison, warming his hands on coffee he wouldn't drink while discussing what he called progress for Wyoming Territory. "I've secured financing for 8,000 head of cattle," Wells said, his Boston accent incongruous against the sheriff's frontier drawl. "My investors see tremendous potential here despite recent setbacks." Sheriff Thomas Riley, 45, and weathered by 15 years enforcing territorial law, studied the immaculately dressed businessmen across his desk. "Mighty optimistic, considering the winter we're having." "Natural selection, Sheriff." Wells smiled, revealing teeth too perfect for a frontier town. "The weak operations will fold, leaving room for scientifically managed ranching. Economies of scale, Mr. Riley." "And folks like Colton who won't sell?" Wells set down his untouched coffee. "Everyone has a price, Sheriff. It's just a matter of finding it." Riley shifted uncomfortably. He'd known Jed Colton since they were boys, remembered the man he'd been before tragedy hollowed him out. "Colton's different. That land's been in his family since territorial days." "Sentiment," Wells dismissed with a wave of his manicured hand. "A luxury few can afford these days." Meanwhile, at the Colton Ranch, Doc Miller worked with methodical precision, her 50 years leaving her face lined, but her hands steady. "Pneumonia setting in," she told Jed, applying a mustard plaster to Eliza's chest. "Caught it early enough. She's strong." "She was riding east to west," Sam observed. "Coming, not going." Doc Miller raised an eyebrow. "Not many women travel alone in Wyoming winter." "Photographer," Jed said, nodding toward the camera case. "Philadelphia newspaper." "First human patient you've let me treat here since Sarah and Thomas," Doc noted, her tone neutral, but her eyes knowing. Jed's face remained impassive. "Didn't have much choice." "There's always a choice, Jed. You just made a different one this time." Outside, the blizzard's fury began to ease, the wind's howl softening to a moan. By morning, paths would need clearing, cattle checking, damage assessing, the endless work of surviving winter. But for now, the 4 occupants of the house formed an uneasy circle of warmth against the cold, too familiar with each other's wounds. 2 strangers, whose presence disturbed the careful isolation Jed had constructed. As dawn approached, Doc Miller packed her supplies. "She'll need watching for the next day or so. Fever might spike again." "I can manage," Jed said. Doc nodded, her gaze lingering on the closed bedroom door across the room. "Been a long time, Jed." He said nothing, and after a moment, she turned to leave. "Abigail," he called, stopping her at the door. The use of her first name hung between them, unfamiliar after years of distance. "Thank you." She nodded once, understanding all he couldn't say, and stepped out into the snow-transformed world. Eliza was still weak from fever when Sam's urgent knock came. The bay mare was foaling, and something was wrong. "A breech birth," Sam explained tersely. "Can't turn it alone." Jed grabbed his coat, already moving toward the door when Eliza's voice stopped him. "I can help." She stood unsteadily, color high in her still feverish cheeks. "You should be resting," Jed countered. "I grew up on a Pennsylvania farm. I know horses." She reached for her own coat, hanging now by the door. "This isn't a garden party with gentle carriage horses, Miss Carter." Eliza met his gaze directly. a flash of steel beneath her fragility. "And I'm not a helpless city woman, Mr. Colton." Something like respect flickered across Jed's face before he nodded once. "Stay behind me. Mare's frightened. Might kick." The barn was warm with animal heat, the air thick with the smell of hay and the distinctive tang of a birth in progress. The bay mare lay on her side in a bed of fresh straw, sides heaving, eyes rolling with pain and fear. "Foal's turned wrong," Sam explained, his sleeves already rolled up, arms blood-streaked to the elbows. "Can't get leverage alone." Eliza moved without hesitation, taking the lantern Sam handed her and positioning herself where the light would be most useful. Her hands were steady, despite her recent illness, her face calm as she watched Jed kneel beside the laboring mare. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice taking on a gentleness Eliza hadn't heard before. His hands moved with practiced confidence, large and calloused, but infinitely careful as they worked to reposition the unborn foal. "Hold her head," he instructed Eliza. "Keep her calm." For the next hour, they worked in near silence, communication reduced to terse instructions and nods of understanding. Eliza stroked the mare's neck, speaking in a low, continuous murmur, while Jed and Sam struggled with the mechanics of saving both mother and foal. When the foal finally emerged, slick, dark, and impossibly fragile, all three humans released a collective breath. The mare nickered softly, turning to her newborn with the timeless instinct of motherhood. "She did it," Eliza whispered, unexpected tears in her eyes. "We all did," Sam corrected, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile. Jed said nothing, but when his eyes met Eliza's over the newborn foal, something passed between them, a moment of shared triumph, of life continuing despite all odds. The moment shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the barn door, they saw a black buggy appear through the swirling snow, its elegant lines incongruous against the rugged landscape. "Wells," Sam muttered, the name carrying all the warmth of a rattlesnake's warning. Jed's face closed like a shuttered window, all trace of the gentle horseman gone. "Get back to the house," he told Eliza. "This isn't a conversation for outsiders." But as Eliza stepped back into the cold, she noticed how Harrison Wells's calculating gaze took in not just the ranch buildings, but her presence specifically, his eyebrows rising with interest that felt more predatory than curious. As they watched the newborn foal take its first wobbling steps, Wells's buggy stopped before the house, its black paint stark against the white, a crow landing in a field of innocence. The morning after the blizzard broke, the Wyoming sun transformed the killing snow into a diamond field that hurt the eyes, beauty and death in the same glance. Jed stood knee-deep in a snowdrift, counting dead cattle partially buried in white. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he made notations in a small leather notebook, face impassive despite the tally's growing weight. 27 so far, he said, as Sam approached, leading their horses through the crusted snow. "Maybe more under the drifts." Sam nodded grimly. "Henderson's lost their entire north herd. How many does that make this winter?" "Too many." Sam's weathered face creased with concern. 4 more ranches likely to fold before spring." They worked in silence, moving methodically across the white expanse of the north pasture. Each dead animal represented dollars they couldn't afford to lose, hay that had been wasted, calves that wouldn't be born in spring. The sound of a camera shutter broke their concentration. Eliza stood some distance away, her tripod set up on a small rise, capturing the stark landscape. Still pale from her illness, she nonetheless moved with purpose, focusing her lens on the sun-sparkled drifts and the dark shapes of the cattle, both living and dead. "I'm sorry about your cattle," she called when she noticed their attention, "but the light on the snow is extraordinary." Jed's expression hardened. "Beauty doesn't feed people, Miss Carter." "Neither does bitterness, Mr. Colton." Her reply came swiftly, without rancor, but with a directness that matched his own. Something like surprise flickered across his face before he turned away, continuing his grim accounting. Few people spoke to him so plainly anymore. Most of the community had learned to tiptoe around his grief, treating him with the awkward deference reserved for the walking wounded. Eliza adjusted her camera, capturing the contrast between the brilliant snow and the dark silhouette of Jed against the endless Wyoming sky. Through her lens, she saw what he couldn't: the stark beauty of his isolation, the dignity in his stubborn resilience. Sam moved to her side, watching her work with quiet curiosity. "Been photographing long?" 15 years, she replied, not looking up from her viewfinder. "Started after my husband died at Gettysburg. The camera, it helps me see beauty where others might only notice loss." Sam's gaze shifted to Jed, then back to Eliza. "Some folks stop seeing beauty altogether. They just need a different lens," she said softly. Jed's sudden tensing interrupted their conversation. Following his gaze, they spotted riders along the property line at the north pasture. Wells men, their purpose unclear, but their presence a clear intrusion. "When cattle die," Sam murmured, "the vultures aren't far behind." Harrison Wells didn't dress like a man who understood Wyoming winters. His eastern wool coat and leather gloves were too fine, too clean, suggesting he'd never used his hands for anything more demanding than counting money. He stood in Jed's yard like he already owned it, appraising the buildings and land with the calculating eye of a man accustomed to assigning value to everything he saw. Beside him, Jimmy Foster shifted nervously, barely 24, and already torn between loyalty and ambition. "Mr. Colton," Wells began, his smile too practiced to be genuine. "I trust you weathered the storm without too much damage?" Jed didn't return the smile. "What brings you to my property, Wells?" Direct as always. Wells seemed amused rather than offended. "I represent investors who recognize the potential of this region. Your property's watershed location makes it particularly valuable. Not for sale. Everything has a price." Wells pulled off his gloves, revealing hands unmarked by labor. "The railroad's coming, whether individual ranchers approve or not. Better to profit than suffer unnecessary hardship." From the porch, Eliza observed the exchange, her photographer's eye catching the tension in Jed's shoulders, the calculated ease in Wells's stance. She'd seen men like Wells before, in Philadelphia boardrooms, in Washington corridors of power, in Richmond during Reconstruction, men who reshaped landscapes to their vision, regardless of who or what stood in their way. "This land's been in my family since before you had your first bank account," Jed said evenly. "Good day, Mr. Wells." Wells's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Perhaps you'd introduce me to your guest. We don't get many visitors from the east in winter." Jed stepped slightly, positioning himself between Wells and the porch where Eliza stood. "Miss Carter is passing through. Her business isn't yours." "Eliza May Carter," Wells said, his tone suggesting recognition. "The photographer whose expose on corporate land practices in Nebraska caused quite a stir last year. My associates found your work provocative." Eliza descended the steps, her camera deliberately visible in her hands. "Mr. Wells, your reputation precedes you as well. I'm flattered you've heard of me." "Don't be." Her smile was polite, but her eyes were cold. Documentation is my specialty. Wells' attention shifted to Jimmy, who stood awkwardly to the side. Young Mr. Foster, the offer I mentioned remains open. Better wages, guaranteed work through spring. A man of your talents deserves appreciation. Jimmy's gaze flickered between Jed and Wells, conflict written plainly across his youthful features. I'll think on it, sir. As Wells' carriage pulled away, Jimmy Foster watched it with the hungry eyes of a young man who saw opportunity. And Jed realized the enemy wasn't just outside his fences anymore. With the storm past and the trails still blocked, the evening stretched before them like neutral territory, a space where, just maybe, words that hadn't been spoken in years might find voice. Jed sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling before him as he reviewed the day's losses. Eliza worked nearby, organizing her photographic plates by the lamplight. The domesticity of the scene felt both foreign and strangely comfortable, the silence between them no longer entirely hostile. "Wells knows who you are," Jed finally said, not looking up from his tallies. "Your work made enemies in Nebraska." "It made change," Eliza corrected, carefully wrapping a glass plate in cloth. "The governor ordered an investigation after my photographs were published." "Investigation doesn't mean justice. It's a start." She set aside her work, studying him across the table. "What was she like?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and unavoidable. For a moment, Jed's face closed, the familiar shutters dropping over his expression. Then, surprising them both, he answered. "Sarah liked to draw, landscapes mostly. Thomas had just started walking when—" His voice trailed off, the words finding their limit. Eliza waited, allowing the silence to hold the space for what couldn't yet be said. "How long has their room been closed?" 12 years. Jed met her eyes directly. "Camera became your way forward?" "The lens keeps things at a distance." "Safer that way." She smiled faintly. "I photograph what I can't control. Beauty, suffering, injustice. Something about capturing it makes it bearable." "And your husband?" "I was married 6 weeks when they brought me his uniform. Not even his body, just blood-stained wool and a letter." Her fingers traced the grain of the wooden table. "After that, I needed purpose more than I needed comfort." Jed nodded, understanding in a way few could. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, two people who had shaped their lives around absence, who had found ways to continue when continuing seemed impossible. Neither mentioned that they'd recognized something in each other, the same wound wrapped in different bandages, and neither acknowledged that, for the first time in years, the wrappings had loosened just enough to let in air. Jed had assumed Eliza's photographs were simply artistic endeavors until he saw the portfolio spread across his kitchen table the next morning. Systematic documentation of corporate land seizures across 3 territories. "My editor at Eastern Quarterly commissioned a series on corporate expansion in the West," Eliza explained, arranging the images in sequence. "These companies use the same methods everywhere. Pressure small owners, manipulate local officials, control water access." Jed studied the photographs with growing interest. Each image told part of a larger story, families standing before homes they were losing, corporate men in fine suits, altered waterways, divided communities. "Just pictures in a magazine back east," he said skeptically. "How does that help anyone here?" "Federal investigations followed my last 3 exposés. Pictures tell stories that can't be ignored." Eliza's voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who had seen her work create real change. "This region is next in my assignment. The pattern of consolidation is spreading west from Nebraska. making you dangerous to men like Wells. Jed's assessment carried new concern for her safety. Documentation is protection. Wells knows that now. She selected another photograph, this one showing a diverted creek that had left farmland barren. His methods in Colorado were particularly aggressive. Water rights manipulation, intimidation, strategic bankruptcies. Same as here. Which is why my editor sent me. She met his gaze directly. I didn't end up at your door by accident, Mr. Colton. Your ranch was on my list of properties being targeted. Jed's expression hardened. You knew who I was before you arrived. I knew your name and your situation. I didn't know, she hesitated, about your family, or that you'd take in a half-frozen stranger during a blizzard. Sam entered with news that interrupted their conversation. Creeks blocked at the north boundary. Ice dams backing up water onto Henderson's place instead of ours. Jed's eyes narrowed. Natural formation? Not likely. Sam's grim expression confirmed the suspicion. Cut marks on trees nearby. Through the kitchen window, they watched Wells's men riding along the north pasture fence line. As they approached the damaged fence section where cattle had died, Eliza's camera shutter clicked, turning invasion into evidence. They're cutting the fence, Jed said quietly, already reaching for his coat. Wait. Eliza's hand on his arm stopped him. Let me document this first. If we confront them now, they'll deny everything and destroy the evidence. Jed hesitated, caught between the instinct to defend his property and the strategic value of her suggestion. They want a reaction, Sam added. Wells is hoping you'll give him reason to involve the sheriff. After a long moment, Jed nodded, though every line of his body communicated the cost of restraint. Take your pictures, Miss Carter, but make them count. The barometer was falling again, faster than Jed had ever seen. But the evidence of Wells's sabotage wouldn't last once the next storm hit. Second storm's brewing, Sam said, examining the sky with practiced eyes. The weak winter sun was already disappearing behind clouds, rolling in from the west, darker and more ominous than the first blizzard. Worse than the last, by my reckoning. Jed pulled his coat tighter, his breath visible in the cold air. We need to check the northern pasture before it hits. Document the fence cutting, check the creek diversion. Could wait until it passes, Sam suggested, concern evident in his voice. North pasture's a good 3 hours' ride in this snow. If we wait, the evidence will be buried. Wells is counting on that. In the barn, Eliza was already preparing her equipment, carefully packing her camera and plates into protected cases. Her face still showed traces of her recent illness, but determination had replaced weakness. I'm coming with you, she said when Jed entered. Not advisable. Not negotiable. She secured the last of her equipment. I need clear photographs before the snow covers everything. That's why I'm here. Sam shook his head. Second storm's always worse. You know that. 2 hours, out and back, Jed replied, though his actions betrayed his words as he methodically packed emergency supplies. Extra blankets, matches in waterproof containers, dried meat, and a small medical kit. You're not fully recovered, Sam told Eliza. I've worked in worse conditions. She adjusted her hat more firmly. Besides, Mr. Colton will protect me, won't you? Something flickered across Jed's face, concern perhaps, or the unfamiliar weight of someone else's trust. He simply nodded, continuing his preparations. If you're not back by midday, I'm coming after you, Sam said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Outside, the horses sensed the approaching storm, their nostrils flaring, hooves stamping nervously. Jed helped Eliza mount, his hands careful but impersonal as he adjusted her stirrups. Stay close, he instructed. If I say we turn back, we turn back. No arguments. Eliza nodded, settling into the saddle. "Lead on, Mr. Colton." As they rode north, the wind shifted suddenly from the west, carrying the scent of snow and a cold that went beyond temperature, the smell of a killer storm that was coming faster than anyone had predicted. The blizzard descended like a predator. One moment they could see the cut fence and cattle tracks leading to Wells' property. The next they were fighting to see each other only feet apart. "We need to turn back," Jed shouted over the howling wind, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. The storm had moved in with unnatural speed, cutting off their route home with blinding sheets of snow. Eliza had managed to photograph the evidence: the cleanly cut fence wires, the deliberately constructed ice dam that diverted their water, the tracks of Wells' men. Now, she hunched in her saddle, her face already crusted with ice beneath her scarf. "I can't feel my hands," she called, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Keep them under your coat." Jed maneuvered his horse alongside hers. "There's a line shack a quarter-mile east. We need to reach it." "How can you know where east is?" Disorientation was clear in her voice, a dangerous sign. "I know this land blindfolded. Trust me." The request wasn't casual. In these conditions, trust meant survival. Visibility dropped to nothing as the full force of the blizzard engulfed them. Jed reached over and took the reins of Eliza's horse, leading both animals through snowdrifts that already reached the horses' chests. He navigated by instinct, by the subtle contours of land he knew better than his own face, by the way the wind hit different parts of his body. Time lost meaning in the white void. Minutes might have been hours as they pushed forward, each step a victory against nature's indifferent force. Eliza's silence became concerning, and Jed reached back periodically to touch her leg, ensuring she remained conscious. "Stay with me," he commanded when he felt her slumping. "Talk to me, Eliza." The use of her first name seemed to penetrate her cold-induced stupor. What should I say?" "Anything. Philadelphia. Your camera. Why blue is better than green." "Blue is the color of distance," she managed. "Things far away always look blue. Keep talking." She continued with fragmented thoughts about color and light, photography and perception, her voice growing weaker but present, a thread of humanity in the howling chaos. When Jed's hand finally struck wood instead of empty air, the relief nearly buckled his knees. The small line shack, little more than a one-room shelter with a stove and bunk, materialized from the whiteness like salvation. "Inside," he ordered, helping her dismount. Her body was rigid with cold, movements clumsy as he guided her through the door. The horses they secured in the small attached lean-to, protected at least from the direct force of the storm. The thermometer outside the line shack had frozen at 20 below zero. But inside, as Jed struggled to light the small stove with trembling hands, both knew the real danger wasn't just the cold, but the secrets the darkness might draw out of them. The cold drove them to share the only blanket, sitting shoulder to shoulder before the meager fire, as Jed fed it precious scraps of wood from the diminishing pile beside the stove. Physical proximity made the emotional distance between them suddenly unbearable. "Will Sam come looking?" Eliza asked, her voice still shaky from cold. "Not in this. He knows better." Jed stared into the flames. "We're on our own until it passes." The wind screamed around the small structure, finding every crack and crevice, sending occasional puffs of snow through invisible gaps. The temperature inside was rising painfully slowly, and Eliza's shivers hadn't fully subsided. "Talk to me," she said suddenly, "like you made me talk out there. Tell me about them." Jed's body tensed beside her, and for a long moment she thought he would refuse. Then, as if the howling storm had worn away his final defenses, he began to speak. I was securing the barn. Storm like this one. His voice was low, almost lost beneath the wind. Sarah went into labor 2 months early. Sam rode for Doc, but the snow was too deep, the wind too strong. He paused, the memory visibly passing across his face. By the time I got back to the house, she was trying so hard. Blood everywhere. No one to help her. Eliza's hand found his beneath the blanket, her fingers curling around his. It wasn't your fault, Jed. I chose the ranch over being with her. Always thought there'd be more time. His free hand clenched into a fist. She named him Thomas with her last breath, made me promise to love him enough for both of them. His voice broke on the final words. He lived almost an hour. My husband enlisted because I said I'd be proud, Eliza said softly, sharing her own guilt. My pride killed him, sent him straight to Gettysburg with a photograph of me in his pocket. We make choices, never know which ones we'll pay for. Jed's eyes, when they finally met hers, held a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. So we stop making choices, stop living? Her voice was gentle, but challenging. Is that what Sarah would have wanted? What Thomas deserved? Don't speak of what you don't understand, he said, but the words lacked heat. I understand choosing emptiness because it hurts less than hope. Her hand tightened on his. I lived in a dark room for 3 years after William died. Breathing chemicals instead of air. At least you chose open sky for your prison. The stove popped as a piece of wood split in the heat, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind's howl had taken on a rhythmic quality, almost like breathing. Why photography? Jed asked after a long silence. Because it captures truth without requiring words. She smiled faintly. And because beauty still exists, even when we're blind to it. As the night deepened around them, words came more easily, memories of Sarah's laugh, Thomas's tiny, perfect fingers, William's letters from the front. Stories never shared now emerged in the isolated sanctuary of the storm, and with each revelation, the space between them diminished. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept side by side on the narrow bunk, the physical intimacy of shared warmth becoming a metaphor for the emotional walls that had begun to crumble. Dawn revealed a world transformed by ice and snow, and 2 people who'd crossed a distance greater than any Wyoming blizzard could create. The morning brought brutal cold, but perfect visibility. The world a blinding white canvas with no sign of human presence except the small shack and their own breath clouds. Beautiful, Eliza murmured, standing in the doorway. Despite the danger they still faced, her photographer's eye couldn't help but appreciate the transformed landscape, every branch encased in ice, sunlight fracturing into rainbows across untouched snow. Beautiful and deadly, Jed replied, checking the horses in the lean-to. Temperatures dropped further. We need to move while the sun's strong. The return journey would be treacherous. The storm had left drifts taller than a man in some places, and the cold was intense enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Jed studied the terrain, calculating their best route. Will the horses make it through these drifts? Eliza asked, pulling on her gloves. They're Wyoming horses, tougher than both of us put together. There was a new ease in Jed's manner, as if the night's confessions had lightened something long carried. They prepared methodically, layering clothing, securing equipment, checking the horse's tack. When Jed helped Eliza mount, his hands lingered slightly longer than necessary, and her smile acknowledged what neither yet had words to express. Last night, she began, then paused. Thank you for trusting me. Been carrying it alone a long time. The simple admission carried the weight of years of solitude. They rode in companionable silence, picking their way carefully through the transformed landscape. Occasionally their eyes would meet, a shared glance at a particularly beautiful ice formation or a momentary challenge overcome. The journey was slow but steady, each mile bringing them closer to safety. It was early afternoon when the ranch buildings finally came into view, smoke rising reassuringly from the chimney. But what surprised them was the activity in the yard. Not just Sam, but Martha Wilson and several other community members clearing paths, repairing storm damage, tending to livestock. "What's all this?" Jed asked as they approached. Martha Wilson, her gray hair peeking from beneath a woolen cap, planted her shovel in the snow. "Folks help folks, Jedediah Colton. Always have, even when some forget." Her stern expression softened. Sam was worried. Word spread. Jed seemed at a loss for words, confronted with this unexpected demonstration of community. People he'd barely spoken to in years were working on his land, repairing his fences, caring for his animals. As they dismounted, Eliza touched his arm briefly. "See? Not everyone's like Wells." Before Jed could respond, she stepped away to check her saddlebags, and he saw her expression change as she realized her editor's deadline was approaching, and with it a choice neither of them had anticipated. "My photographs," she said, her voice suddenly professional again. "They need to be developed and sent east within the week. The magazine goes to print on the 15th. The warmth that had grown between them seemed to cool as reality intruded. Jed nodded, understanding the implicit message. She would need to leave as soon as the trails were passable. "Martha," he called, turning toward the postmistress. "When's the next mail coach?" "Should be through tomorrow if the pass is clear," Martha replied, her observant eyes moving between Jed and Eliza, noting the tension that hadn't been there moments before. "I'll need passage east," Eliza said, not quite meeting Jed's eyes. As Martha Wilson explained how the community had rallied to help with storm damage, the unspoken now hung heavy between Jed and Eliza. The knowledge that what had begun in a blizzard's isolation would soon face the test of separation. The mail coach arrived 3 days after the storm cleared, bringing news of the outside world and a reminder that Eliza Carter belonged to that world, not Jed's. Morning light slanted across the yard as the driver secured his team, stamping his feet against the cold. "Made good time from Cheyenne," he announced. "Trails mostly clear, south and east." Eliza stood on the porch, her bags and equipment packed and ready. The changes of the past week were visible in small ways. Her confidence in moving around the ranch, the way Sam nodded respectfully when she spoke, the quiet understanding that occasionally passed between her and Jed. All of it about to end. "My editor extended my deadline once already," she explained, her voice carefully professional as Jed helped load her bags. "If I miss it again—" "You have obligations. I understand obligation." Jed's voice had returned to the distant tone he'd used when they first met, his movements efficient and impersonal. Martha Wilson watched from nearby, her expression clearly disapproving of the sudden formality between them. She'd arrived earlier, ostensibly to collect mail, but really to witness the departure that had become the subject of quiet speculation in town. "I've documented Wells's methods thoroughly," Eliza continued, clutching her camera bag close. "The magazine will run the expose next month. It should create enough pressure for a territorial investigation." Jed nodded, his focus on securing a strap rather than meeting her eyes. "Your work's important." "Jed," Eliza began, lowering her voice, "when this assignment is complete, perhaps I could—" "Safe travels, Miss Carter," he cut her off, stepping back from the coach. Weather should hold for your journey. Something flickered in Eliza's eyes, hurt, resignation, understanding. As is yours, Mr. Colton. She matched his formality, though her voice softened as she added, "Thank you for your hospitality." Martha stepped forward to embrace Eliza. "You come back and see us when you can, dear. Some of us," she emphasized with a pointed look at Jed, "remember how to welcome visitors properly." The driver called for any final items, and Eliza climbed into the coach, settling beside the window. For a moment, as the horses began to move, her eyes sought Jed's one last time, a gaze heavy with unspoken words and possibilities left unexplored. Jed didn't watch the coach leave. He'd learned 12 years ago that watching someone go didn't make the leaving hurt any less. Instead, he turned toward the barn, his shoulders set in the familiar lines of solitude, as if the past week had been merely an interruption in his carefully constructed isolation. "Stubborn as a Wyoming winter, that one," Martha muttered to no one in particular as she collected her mail pouch, "and twice as cold when he wants to be." The irrigation system collapse might have looked like spring runoff damage to anyone else, but Jed recognized sabotage when he saw it, and Jimmy Foster's nervous avoidance told the rest of the story. "Diversion dam's completely gone," Sam reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Channel's been rerouted to flood the south pasture instead of filling the reservoir." Jed surveyed the damage with an expert eye. Without the reservoir to collect snowmelt for summer irrigation, the ranch's hay production would be cut by half. Without hay, fewer cattle could survive next winter. The calculation was simple and devastating. "When did Wells hire you, Jimmy?" Jed asked quietly as the young ranch hand approached, keeping a noticeable distance. Jimmy's face paled. "Mr. Colton, I never—" "Don't lie to me, boy. Not about this." Jed's voice remained even, but his eyes were hard. "He said he'd just pay me for information," Jimmy finally admitted, his shoulders slumping. "Which fields you were using, where the weak spots were. Never said anything about breaking things." "But you knew what the information was for." Jimmy couldn't meet his eyes. "He offered me foreman position on his new operation. Said small ranches like yours wouldn't last another year anyway." Sam stepped forward, fists clenched. "You ungrateful—" "Sam." Jed's quiet command stopped him. To Jimmy, he simply said, "Get your gear and get out. Mr. Colton, please. You made your choice." The finality in Jed's tone brooked no argument. As Jimmy rode away, Jed surveyed the damage to both his ranch and his brittle trust in others, both confirming what he'd known all along: letting people in only gave them better angles to hurt you. "We can repair some of it," Sam said, already calculating the work ahead. "Reroute the main channel, rebuild a smaller dam." "With what?" Jed gestured to the scattered timbers and stones. "We're short-handed now, low on supplies, and Wells knows it. He'll keep pushing until we break or sell." "Community helped during the storm," Sam reminded him. "Might help again." "Not my way." "Your way isn't working, Jed." The rare criticism from his oldest friend hung in the cold air between them. Jed turned away, his expression closing like a door. "Check the south boundary. Make sure they haven't hit there too." Sam hesitated, then nodded, recognizing the familiar retreat. As he rode away, Jed remained by the ruined dam, mentally calculating costs he couldn't afford, repairs that would drain what little reserve he had left, and the growing likelihood that the land his family had held for generations would slip through his fingers after all. The cold clarity of failure felt almost like relief. Confirmation that hope was indeed the most dangerous indulgence of all. Jed hadn't entered the guest room since Eliza left, as if the space itself might contain too many reminders. But when Sam mentioned seeing her journal on the bedside table, something stronger than caution pulled him through the doorway. The room was painfully neat, the bed made with military precision, no personal traces remaining except for the small, leather-bound book on the nightstand. Jed stood in the doorway for a long moment, propriety warring with curiosity and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. Finally, he crossed to the table and picked up the journal. It was well worn, its pages filled with Eliza's neat, decisive handwriting. Opening it felt like trespassing, but the glimpse of his own name on a page stopped his hand from closing it again. February 15th, 1888. The man thinks he's built walls, but he's constructed windows. I see through to everything he tries to hide. There's kindness beneath the gruffness, purpose behind the isolation. He treats his horses with more gentleness than he allows himself. Jed's fingers tightened on the book. He should stop reading, respect her privacy, as she had respected his grief. Instead, he turned the page. February 17th. Nearly died today. Instead, found myself truly living for the first time since William. Photography taught me to capture moments. Jedediah Colton is teaching me to live in them. In that line shack, with death prowling outside, I saw a man emerge from behind his own fortress. What we shared wasn't just survival, it was resurrection. The next entries detailed her observations of Wells' operations, meticulous notes about water rights manipulation, intimidation tactics, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable ranchers. Her documentation was thorough, professional, evidence gathered by a journalist's trained eye. But it was the final entry that stopped his breath. February 20th. When this assignment is complete, I will return to Wyoming. Not for any story, but for the man who doesn't believe in second chances. I intend to change his mind. The Eastern Quarterly has offered me a permanent Western correspondent position. I could work from anywhere with mail service, even a remote Wyoming ranch, if its owner were amenable. Tucked between the journal's pages were photographs he hadn't seen, images of his land captured through her eyes. The ranch at dawn, mist rising from the snow, the new foal taking its first wobbling steps. And one that startled him, himself, unaware of the camera, gentling the troublesome colt, his face transformed by a tenderness he scarcely recognized. Behind these were more practical images, Wells's men cutting the fence, the sabotaged creek diversion, tracks leading directly back to Wells's property. Evidence more damning than anything Jed could have gathered alone. He closed the journal carefully, suddenly seeing the past week through new eyes. What he'd interpreted as professional detachment had been something else entirely, a woman seeing possibilities where he saw only endings. Jed tucked the journal and photographs into his coat, and for the first time in 12 years, he rode toward town with purpose beyond mere survival. The fortress door had opened from within. Martha Wilson had owned Garrison's General Store for 35 years, which meant she'd seen Jedediah Colton grow from a boy to a man to a ghost, until he walked through her door that evening, looking more alive than he had in 12 years. "Well, I'll be," she said, pushing her spectacles up her nose. "Has hell frozen over, or just your water pipes?" Isaiah Jenkins looked up from his ledger behind the counter, his weathered face registering genuine surprise. "Jed Colton. Thought you only came to town for supplies twice a year." "Need your help," Jed said simply, removing his hat. "Both of you." He spread Eliza's photographs across the counter. Clear images of Wells' men cutting fences, diverting water, trespassing on Colton land. Wells is squeezing every small ranch on the watershed, trying to force us all out before spring. Martha studied the images with narrowed eyes. Heard the Hendersons might sell next week. Can't blame them after losing half their herd. These photos, Isaiah tapped one showing the sabotaged irrigation system, they're Miss Carter's work? She left her journal too. Wells approached everyone with property on that watershed, offered cash or consequences. We have evidence now, Jed continued, his voice gaining conviction. Photographs, documentation, enough for the territorial authorities to investigate. We? Martha's eyebrows rose knowingly. That photographer woman got under your skin, didn't she? Jimmy Foster was mucking stalls in Wells' main barn when Jed found him. The young man froze, manure fork in hand, his face a study in shame and defiance. Mr. Colton. Need to talk, Jimmy, Jed said, leaning against the stall door. Not here to hurt you. Jimmy's shoulders remained tense. Already said what needed saying. No, you didn't. Jed's voice was surprisingly gentle. 12 years ago, I made a choice that cost me everything that mattered. Been hiding from that choice ever since. The unexpected confession clearly caught Jimmy off guard. What's that got to do with me? Choices define us, but they don't have to prison us. Jed stepped closer, lowering his voice. Wells tell you what happens to the small ranchers who sell. How many of them get those foreman positions he promises? Uncertainty flickered across Jimmy's face. Said I had potential. So did Peterson and Anderson before him. Both working as hands on Wells' Colorado spread now, barely making wages. Jed's eyes held Jimmy's steadily. Need to know what Wells is planning next. Time to choose which side of this fence you're standing on. Sheriff Riley studied the photographs spread across his desk, his expression growing grimmer with each image. This is serious, Jed. Clear evidence of property damage, water rights violations. Around Riley's office stood the core of the resistance. Martha, Isaiah, Sam, and surprisingly Jimmy Foster standing nervously near the door. Territorial governors sending an investigator next week, Riley continued. These photographs, plus Jimmy's testimony about Wells's operations, should be enough to halt his expansion plans. He won't wait a week, Jimmy interjected. After the irrigation dam, he said the Colton place would be his by month's end, one way or another. He's planning something bigger, Jed agreed. Something to force my hand before help arrives. Martha's practical voice cut through the tension. We organize watches, 2-person teams, rotating shifts, cover the property boundaries, especially water access points. I've alerted neighboring ranchers, Isaiah added. Henderson's still holding out. Says if you're fighting, he's with you. As they finalized their strategy, a messenger arrived with a telegram for Jed. His face hardened as he read the brief message. What is it? Sam asked. Jed passed the paper wordlessly. Withdraw accusations or Miss Carter's reputation and career destroyed. Final warning. Eliza, Jed said quietly, the name carrying weight beyond its syllables. He's threatening Eliza. Dawn had barely broken when the first attack came. Smoke rising from the eastern barn as flames licked hungrily at the dry timber. The warning bell's clang shattered the morning stillness, summoning defenders from where they'd been stationed around the property. Fire! Sam's voice carried across the yard as Jed raced from the house, pulling on his coat. Silhouetted against the growing blaze, 3 of Wells's men retreated toward the property line, the sabotage complete. But what they hadn't anticipated was the response. Not just Sam and Jed, but Martha Wilson, Isaiah Jenkins, the Hendersons, and half a dozen other neighboring ranchers who'd kept vigil through the night. Bucket line, Henderson shouted. already organizing the community into an efficient firefighting unit. Women too! Everyone! The flames roared higher, threatening to spread to nearby structures. As Jed worked alongside neighbors he'd barely spoken to in years, the irony wasn't lost on him. The fortress he'd built against connection was now being saved by the very connections he'd rejected. The fire was nearly contained when the sound of approaching horses drew attention to the road. Through the smoke appeared a carriage escorted by two official-looking riders, and in the front seat, her hair wild from the journey, sat Eliza. "Territorial investigators," Sam breathed, recognizing the government insignia. Jed stood frozen, water bucket in hand, as Eliza leapt from the still-moving carriage and ran toward him. Behind her, a stern-faced man in a government coat surveyed the smoldering barn with narrowed eyes. "I received your message," she said, breathless. "Caught the first train back. These men are from the governor's office. They've been investigating wells across 3 territories." "You came back." The simple wonder in Jed's voice made her pause. "Of course I came back." Her hand found his, heedless of the soot and dirt. "I was always coming back." One of the officials approached, extending a document. "Mr. Colton, Governor's orders to cease all operations by Harris and Wells, pending investigation. Your evidence, combined with Miss Carter's previous documentation, was most compelling." With Wells' men retreating and the officials taking statements from witnesses, Jed led Eliza away from the crowd toward the quiet of the house. Standing in the kitchen that had witnessed their first real conversations, the words he'd rehearsed in her absence suddenly seemed inadequate. "I found your journal," he admitted. "Shouldn't have read it, but—" "I left it for you to find," she interrupted, a small smile playing at her lips. "Some things are easier to write than say. I've spent 12 years thinking the safest place was alone." Jed's voice roughened with emotion. "Believing that caring just gave life more ammunition. And now? Now I know there are things worse than loss." His hand reached tentatively for hers. "The emptiness after you left was one of them." Eliza stepped closer, her photographer's eyes taking in every detail of his face. The new lines of determination, the softened eyes, the tentative hope replacing resignation. "I'm not Sarah," she said softly. "I can't replace what you lost. I don't want replacement. I want beginning." Jed took both her hands in his. "If you'll weather Wyoming winters with a stubborn rancher who's learning, too late maybe, that fortress walls keep out more than just pain." As spring's first pale sunlight broke through the window, the newly born foal they had delivered together took its first steps in the green pasture, while inside, 2 people who had each survived their own winters began to plan a shared thaw.